Hey, Cypher here, coming at you with another diatribe, this time talking about this whole idea that I see in the comments a lot of the official story. If you couldn't tell, I think it's utter poppycock, but there is an underlying notion behind it. You see, I just came back from the library getting a bunch of information about the Roswell incident in New Mexico. This was specifically to help out Tristan from Step Back History, who happens to have a video on the subject coming out right around now. And Roswell's one of those ones that you'll often hear people talking about like, you can't believe the official story. So, what do they mean by that? Now, normally who use this idea of an official story are using it disingenuously in a specific way, trying to say like, oh, well, that's what the police are telling you, but you can't believe them. But it's not up to the government or the police or any of those people to tell you the story. That's not how a story is made. A story is made through evidence, just as I gathered today. And especially in the case of Roswell, there was actually a main figure here in New Mexico who was trying to release all the information he could on the Roswell incident. He was a congressman from here for a little bit, and I think he was mostly doing it to gain some publicity for the state. Although some of his letters do seem to have a genuine interest. So what he was doing, along with everyone before him, was submitting something called a Freedom of Information Act request. These FOIAs, as they're often called, are essentially just a letter to the government saying, hey, I want this information, give it to me. And if it's not a national security threat, they're legally obligated to give it out. And pretty much anyone can do this. They can just send in a letter to the CIA and say, hey, give me all your information about MK Ultra, and they basically have to give it to you. Although some of these letters will say like, look, we already have dealt with 1 million requests, just go to the Library of Congress, it's right down the street, or something along those lines. Once the information is released into the National Archives, it's probably openly available to anyone. But that's what people are talking about when they're saying that there's an official story, is the information that hasn't been released. Because, well, for instance, like the JFK assassination, you had problems with Cuba and diplomacy that didn't want to be revealed. But from that doubt that's instilled from withholding information, people will begin to just deny everything and make up their own stories. That's called conspiracy theorism. And conspiracism is just essentially history denial. For instance, Holocaust deniers are conspiracy theorists, or moon hoaxers, or 9/11 truthers, or any of those sorts. That's conspiracy theorism, where they take something where there's nuggets that are being withheld and make it into a larger thing that they make up a whole new story because they doubt some particular facet. So instead, I want to explain how an official story, or in reality just the story, as in history, is created, in terms of dealing with secret information and how that secret information, and I do mean information withheld from the public, how that information becomes available and how historians deal with it. Because trust me, every historian has a horror story about having to go through a FOIA request. In my case, it wasn't exactly FOIA. I was dealing with the British government, and I was asking for access to the British War Cabinet documents for World War I containing information about the Russian intervention of 1918 to 1920. When I was doing all my research for that, that still wasn't actually publicly available, at least in the US. It was digitized and maybe available to the British, but no American had been granted access yet. So I actually had to put my information in as a request, and it did go in front of Parliament. Probably with, thousands upon thousands of other names, but somewhere in the parliamentary record is my name. And essentially all they do is look through all these requests and say, yes, give access, yes, give access, yes, give access, that is national security, so don't give access, and so on and so forth. That's how redacting is done. There's entire segments of the archivist profession dedicated to making sure that the right information gets out at the right time. It's called embargoing. So you will make information unavailable for a certain period of time. Luckily, in terms of the Russian intervention thing, it went through just fine and I was able to access all of it that I needed. But that also means that nobody prior to my paper, at least that I could find, had ever actually referenced those documents. So it was possible that I could challenge the current scholarship on the subject with new information. I ultimately found that I don't think they knew what the heck they were doing, and that was kind of in line with what the popular consensus was at the time. There was the revisionist perspective where people were saying, well, it was purely about anti-communism, and then there was also the very orthodox perspective of like, oh, well, it was purely to deal with World War I. Neither of those perspectives really hold up to scrutiny, especially if you're using the British cabinet documents. But you can see here where people are getting an idea of like an official story is that like, well, what if those cabinet documents disproved the consensus view? But that's just wrong-headed if you think that disproving the consensus view means that there shouldn't be any view at all until those documents are revealed? What? No, you have to work with the information that you have. You don't get to just make it up. That's what conspiracism is for, and they're a bunch of crackpots. You have to work with the evidence you've got. So if there's some sort of mass shooter incident, for instance, and people are dissatisfied with what the police are telling them, that doesn't mean that you get to just make up your own story. You have to deal with the evidence you've got. You can doubt what's being said, but you can't make up your own story instead. And this whole limitation of access to information actually works at pretty much all levels of history. In fact, local history is some of the most difficult information to get at. When I was doing my master's thesis about San Luis Obispo history, I had to do a lot of local history, and I had to get at local archives. Some of these archives really weren't available to the public. And here I'm coming in, some master's student, trying to say, oh yeah, this place was super violent and I want to prove it. You can see why some people would be a bit reluctant to show you what they've got in their archives. Seriously, some archivists can be pretty tight-lipped, and that means that you have to really befriend them. But that also means that there's a lot of information that's embargoed and could inspire this whole idea of an official story. Once again, there's no such thing as an official story, but there is such a thing as limitations on evidence. If you're just not friendly with the local archivist, they may choose to just not let you see the information that you really need to see in order to make the argument that you're going to make. Luckily, I was pretty well insinuated with the local community in San Luis Obispo, so my history work never really was impeded by that, but I did see it happening to other people. Some people were just not given access to things that were thought to be too sensitive. But once again, that doesn't mean that there is an official story. That just means that there are blank spots in history, and there will always be blank spots. That doesn't mean that you get to fill them in with your imagination. You see, history is a collaborative effort. It's not something static that just sits there waiting to be discovered. People have to argue it with these things, you know? That's the whole point. We're trying to develop a narrative. By doing so, that means that we have to get new evidence, new interpretations, all that kind of stuff being baked in until we get to a better and better story, a better and better understanding of the past. But the only way to do that is with evidence. And if there's evidence that you just can't get at, then we can't make an argument. That doesn't mean that you get to come in and do conspiracy theories. Instead, that means that we have to sit there and go, I don't know. You know you are pretty well versed in your subject if you can name mysteries that are left out of history. Or even how every little aspect that you think of as the standard story is challenged in some way by one minuscule little thing kind of sitting there unacknowledged. That's the thing about being a historian. You often have to say, I don't know.